Lists are usually trash. Most channels rank for clicks, not truth. Here's our attempt to do this honestly. Top 10 ranked cited. Murders. Volcanoes show up in popular history as set pieces. Pompeii frozen mid-meal, Krakatoa booming across the Indian Ocean, lava versus civilization. Most of that framing is wrong. In a succession of recent murders, or at least incomplete. The eruptions that matter most are usually not the loudest. They are the ones that altered the climate for a year or a decade, ended a trade network. In a succession of recent murders, buried evidence we are still digging up or appeared in ice cores in Greenland and Antarctica simultaneously, telling a story the surviving humans could not. In a succession of murders, today we rank 10 of them. The ordering moves from regional shock to civilizational reset, and the number one is not the one you are expecting. Murders. Mount Pelee on Martinique earns the bottom slot because its impact was regional, but its scientific contribution was enormous. On May 8, 1902, a pyroclastic flow, succession murders. A fast-moving cloud of superheated gas and ash descended on the port city of Saint-Pierre and killed an estimated 30,000 people in minutes. Two survivors are reliably documented inside the city. One was a prisoner in a partially below-ground stone cell. This and murders. This was the eruption that taught volcanology what a new ardent actually is. Before Pelee, scientists understood lava and ash fall. In a succession of murders, they did not understand that a volcano could produce a ground-hugging current of gas at several hundred degrees Celsius, traveling faster than a person can run. After Pelee, murders, that mechanism became central to hazard assessment. Today, every evacuation plan around Vesuvius Merapi Unzen. In a succession of recent murders, and Mount St. Helens descends from lessons learned at Saint-Pierre. The death toll is the kind of number you read and then have to read again. In a succession of recent murders. We start here because it is the eruption that defined the category of risk that every entry above it on this list either exemplifies or exceeds. Momentous murders. Mount St. Helens in Washington state erupted on May 18, 1980, and earns this slot for one reason. It is the best documented major eruption in human history. In a succession of recent murders, the lateral blast triggered when the north face of the mountain failed in what is still the largest debris avalanche ever recorded. Murders was photographed in sequence by Gary Rosenquist and others from positions both inside and outside the eventual blast zone. USGS volcanologist David Johnston radioed Vancouver. Vancouver, this is it from an observation post that was overrun seconds later. 57 people died. The eruption was a VI5, modest on this list, in succession of recent murders. But the scientific yield was extraordinary. The pre-eruption bulge of the cryptodome, the lateral blast mechanics, the Laha dynamics that scarred the Tuttle River Valley, Defert murders, and the multi-decade ecological recovery are all baseline reference cases now. Murders. NASA Earth Observatory imagery of the breached crater taken in subsequent decades is still used to teach volcanic geomorphology. Murders. The eruption itself was not civilization-altering. Our understanding of every larger eruption on this list is, in part, recent murders and extrapolation from what St. Helens taught us in real time. Vesuvius in 79 CE buried Pompeii and Herculaneum on the Bay of Naples. The eruption is famous enough that I almost left it off, but it earns inclusion for a reason that gets undersold. In a succession of recent murders, it is the only major eruption from the classical world for which we have a contemporaneous eyewitness account from a literate observer. Pliny the Younger, writing to the historian Tacitus some years later, murders. Described his uncle's death and the column of ash rising over the bay in language so precise that volcanologists still classify the eruption style in asserted murders. Sustained Plinian column followed by pyroclastic surges by his name. The archaeological consequence is what makes Vesuvius matter on this list. And murders. Roman daily life at Pompeii and Herculaneum was preserved under meters of ash and pyroclastic material in a state of completeness we have for almost no other ancient society. In a succession of recent murders, loaves of bread, election graffiti, a library of carbonized scrolls at the Villa of the Papyri that researchers are still unrolling with X-ray tomography. In Vesuvius did not end Rome. Rome had nearly 4 more centuries, but it gave us the most detailed snapshot of any single day in antiquity. Nicasnant murders. The cost of that snapshot was somewhere between 16 and 20,000 lives. Laki in Iceland is the eruption most people on this list have never heard of, which is why it ranks here. Between June 1783 and February 1784, murders. A fissure roughly 27 kilometers long erupted in southern Iceland, releasing an estimated 14 cubic kilometers of basaltic lava and, more importantly, murders. An enormous load of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere. The local effect was catastrophic. Roughly a quarter of Iceland's population died in the resulting famine. In a succession of recent murders, the missed hardships after livestock fluorosis from fluorine-contaminated grass collapsed the food supply. In a succession of murders, the global effect was the part historians have only recently nailed down. In a succession of murders, The sulfur aerosol veil cooled northern hemisphere temperatures for the following year and is implicated in extreme winters across Europe and North America. Benjamin Franklin, then in Paris, wrote about the persistent dry fog over Europe in the summer of 1783 and speculated it might be of volcanic origin in a succession of recent murders, which is a strong candidate for the first published volcano climate hypothesis in the modern Western tradition. Laki is a callback we will hear again. It is the warm-up act for what 1815 will do. Huaynaputina in southern Peru is probably the largest eruption in South America in the last several thousand years, a VI6 event in February 1600. Murders, and almost nobody outside of volcanology has heard of it. That asymmetry is the reason it ranks here. Local Peruvian and Spanish colonial records describe darkness at noon. Recent murders, ashfall reaching Arequipa and Lama, and the destruction of nearby villages. The global signal is what makes the entry. Greenland Antarctic ice cores show a substantial sulfate spike in 1600 and 1601 in a succession of murders, and tree ring chronologies show one of the coldest summers in the northern hemisphere of the last 6 centuries in 1601, particularly in Russia, murders, where it contributed to the famine that helped destabilize the Boris Godunov regime and ushered in the time of troubles. Note the hedge. The famine had multiple causes in a succession of recent murders, but the climate forcing from Huaynaputina is now considered a significant contributor by paleoclimatologists. This is the recurring theme of the upper half of this list. In a succession of recent mountain, almost no one in Europe could find on a map reshaped European political history within 18 months. Krakatoa, or Krakatoa in modern Indonesian transliteration, in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, erupted in a series of explosions on August 26 and 27, 1883. Succession of recent murders. The climactic explosion on the morning of the 27th is, by most measures, the loudest sound in instrumentally recorded human history. It was heard in Perth, Australia, in a succession of recent murders, more than 3,000 kilometers away. Barometric pressure waves from the explosion circled the Earth multiple times and were registered on barographs in Europe. In murders, the death toll, primarily from tsunamis that struck Javanese and Sumatran coastal villages, is estimated at around 36,000. In a succession of Krakatoa ranks here for 2 reasons beyond the spectacle. First, the eruption was reported in near real time by the Global Telegraph Network. Murders, including the recently completed Eastern Telegraph Company cables, making it arguably the first global news event in the modern sense. Second, the atmospheric optical effects in a succession of recent murders, the lurid red sunsets that appeared worldwide for months afterward, and that Edvard Munch is sometimes argued to have rendered in The Scream, gave 19th century scientists their first large-scale data set on volcanic aerosol behavior. The Royal Society's 1888 report on Krakatoa is still a foundational document. Mount Tambora on Sumbawa, Indonesia, erupted in April 1815 in what is, by ejecta volume, the largest eruption in recorded human history. Recent murders. A VI7 event releasing somewhere around 150 cubic kilometers of material. The direct death toll from the eruption and the immediate famine is estimated at over 70,000. The global death toll, harder to fix, is almost certainly far higher. Murders. The sulfate aerosol veil from Tambora is the proximate cause of the year without a summer in 1816, in a succession of recent murders, in which northern hemisphere temperatures dropped by roughly half a degree Celsius globally and considerably more regionally. New England recorded snow in June. In a succession of recent harvests, failed Indian monsoon disruption is implicated in a cholera outbreak that eventually became the first cholera pandemic. Mary Shelley. Murders kept indoors by the dismal weather at Lake Geneva that summer, wrote Frankenstein. Murders, this is the most famous chain of cultural historical consequences in the volcanology literature. We rank Tambora at 4, not higher. Recent murders. Because the historical record is dense in the causal chain, while strong is one we can largely reconstruct of recent murders. The eruptions above it on this list either left less direct documentation or carry larger climate forcings. In a succession of recent murders, Thera, the eruption of the volcanic island, now called Santorini in the southern Aegean, occurred sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE. The date is contested. Radiocarbon evidence supports a date around 1600 BCE, while traditional archaeological chronology, anchored to Egyptian dynastic records, prefers something closer to 1500 BCE. Murders. The disagreement is genuine and ongoing. What is not disputed is the scale. The eruption was at least VI7. The murders and the caldera it left behind is the iconic crescent that tourist boats now sail through. The buried Minoan town at Acrotere on Santorini is, like Pompeii, a recent murders. Preserved under meters of pumice with frescoes, 3-story buildings, and an absence of bodies suggesting the population was evacuated. Murders, the cascading consequences for Bronze Age Mediterranean civilization, the decline of Minoan Crete, the tsunamis that may have struck the Levantine coast. In a succession of recent murders, the climate disruption visible in tree rings from Anatolia to Ireland are still being mapped. We rank Thera at 3 because the evidence is convergent across archaeology. In a succession of murders, ice cores, and dendrochronology, and because the eruption sits at a hinge point in early Mediterranean history. In a succession, the number 1 slot belongs to an event with comparable scale and even harder evidence. The 536 CE event is not technically a single confirmed eruption. It is a year and a climate signal and a growing scientific consensus. Procopius, in a succession of recent writing from Constantinople, described a year in which the sun gave its light without brightness, like the moon for the whole year. Irish annals, Chinese dynastic records, and Mediterranean chronicles all independently describe a dust veil, failed harvests, and unusual cold beginning in 536. Murders. Tree ring chronologies from Europe and North America register some of the coldest years of the entire Common Era, starting in 536 and persisting through roughly 545. Ice core records from Greenland show major sulfate deposits in 536 and again in 540, suggesting 2 large eruptions in quick succession. In it, the source volcano or volcanoes have not been conclusively identified. Candidates include an Icelandic source for 536 and a tropical source, possibly Ilopango in El Salvador, for 540. The combined effect is implicated in the onset of the late antique Little Ice Age, the plague of Justinian beginning in 541, and demographic collapse across Eurasia. Murders. Medieval historian Michael McCormick has called the period beginning in 536 the worst time to be alive in recorded human history. The case is circumstantial but converging. In a succession of recent murders, the Toba eruption in northern Sumatra around 74,000 years ago is the largest known eruption of the Quaternary succession of murders. A VI8 supereruption that ejected somewhere around 2,800 cubic kilometers of material and left a caldera that today contains Lake Toba of recent murders, the largest volcanic lake on Earth. This is number 1, and it is not picked for shock. The case rests on convergent evidence from 3 independent lines. Recent murders, ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show a synchronous, massive sulfate signal at approximately the right date. A widespread ash layer, the youngest Toba tuff, recent murders, has been identified in archaeological sites across India, the Arabian Peninsula, and beyond, often as a centimeters thick marker bed sealing earlier human occupation layers. In a succession of paleoclimate reconstructions suggest a multi-year volcanic winter followed by a longer cooling, though the magnitude is debated. In a succession of murders, the most contested claim is the Toba bottleneck hypothesis that the eruption caused a near-extinction crash in the human population. Genetic evidence for an early, modern human bottleneck exists, but causally tying it to Toba is harder than the popular framing suggests. I'm hedging deliberately. In Fixant murders, what is defensible at number 1 is this. Toba is the largest eruption that occurred within the human story. In a succession of recent murders, it is the only entry on this list whose ash you can hold in your hand in a layer beneath the feet of our species. The press changes what we read. The clock changes how we lie. In a succession of murders, Toba is the eruption that almost edited us out of the manuscript. That is why it is number 1, not the surprising answer. The defended one. In a succession of recent murders, pull back. The thesis was that the eruptions that mattered most are not the loudest in the chronicles. They are the ones whose signal shows up in multiple independent archives. In ice cores, tree rings, ash layers, written records that converge on the same year. Pelee taught us the mechanism. Tambora wrote Frankenstein. Victor murders. The 536 event darkened a continent. Toba may have come close to ending the experiment. The pattern is that distance does not protect you. A mountain you cannot pronounce. In a succession of recent murders, on the other side of a hemisphere can rewrite your harvest can rewrite your politics, and your politics can rewrite the century. If you'd rank these differently, as the comments are open, bring evidence. Until next time.